Good morning. Welcome to Chapter 6, Part 1 for The Love of Man. Where we left off, you had the horrific scene at the end of Chapter 5 where the incompetence of Mercedes, Charles, and Hal leads the team into the ice. And at the very last moment, Buck is saved by John Thornton. And for your work today, when we're done reading, I'm going to have you write a paragraph about why Buck ends up developing love for John Thornton. Why is it that John Thornton is the type of person that brings out love in Buck rather than like just respect or like the willingness to follow? This is something deeper. Okay, so let's start reading. And one of the things to know is that because John Thornton got frostbite, this is the reason that he's around and is resting and has the ability to kind of take the time to take care of Buck to begin with. All right, let's start reading. When John Thornton froze his feet in the previous December, his partners had made him comfortable and left him to get well, going on themselves up the river to get a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but with the continued warm weather, even the slight limp left him, and here, lying by the riverbank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of birds and the hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. A rest comes very good after one has traveled 3,000 miles, and it must be confessed that Buck waxed lazy as his wounds healed. His muscles swelled out and the flesh came back to cover his bones. For that matter, they were all loafing, Buck, John Thornton, and Skeet and Nig, waiting for the raft to come that was to carry them down to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who made friends with Buck, who in a dying condition was unable to resent her first advances. She had the doctor trait which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, so she washed and cleaned Buck's wounds. Regularly each morning after he had finished his breakfast, she performed her self-appointed task till he came to look for her, ministrations, or taking care of him as much as he did for Thornton's. Nig, another dog, equally friendly, though less demonstrative, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound and half deerhound, with eyes that laughed and a boundless good nature. So the word convalescence is a time of healing. This is something that Buck needs for like his body, soul, and spirit after the cruel treatment that he went under. To Buck's surprise, these dogs manifested no jealousy towards him. They seemed to share the kindliness and largeness of John Thornton, and as Buck grew stronger, they enticed him or dragged him into all sorts of ridiculous games in which Thornton himself could not forbear to join. And in this fashion, Buck romped through his convalescence and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was his for the first time. This he had never experienced at Judge Miller's down in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. With the judge's sons hunting and tramping, it had been a working partnership. With the judge's grandsons, a sort of pompous guardianship, and with the judge himself, a stately and dignified friendship. But love that was feverish and burning, that was adoration, that was madness, it had taken John Thornton to arouse. This man had saved his life, which was something. But further, he was the ideal master. Other men saw to the welfare of their dogs from a sense of duty and business expediency. He saw to the welfare as if they were his own children because he could not help it. And he saw further. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a cheering word, and to sit down for a long talk with them, a gas he called it, was as much his delight as theirs. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, the while calling him ill names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than the rough embrace and the sound of murmured oaths, and at each jerk back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was its ecstasy. And when released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes eloquent, his throat vibrant with unuttered sound, and in that fashion remained without movement. John Thornton would reverently exclaim, "God, you can all but speak." Buck had a trick of love expression that was akin to hurt. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and close it so fiercely that the flesh bore the impression of his teeth for some time afterward. And as Buck understood the oaths to be love words, so the man understood this feigned bite for a caress. And for the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. So before this part, you see that there's all these different ways they have of expressing their love for each other. So with Buck, it's like grabbing Thornton's hand and holding onto it, and they have this almost like their own language of communication to reveal to each other how much adoration that they have. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek these tokens. Unlike Skeet, who was wont to shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge till petted, or Nig, who would stalk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee, Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager and alert, at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, following it with the keenest interest, each fleeting expression, every movement or change of feature. Or, as chance might have it, he would lie farther away to the side or rear, watching the outlines of the man and the occasional movements of his body. And often, such was the communion in which they lived, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze without speech, his heart shining out of his eyes as Buck's heart shone out. And for a time after the rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight, and from the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient masters, since he had come to the Northland, had bred in him a fear that no master could be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half-breed had passed on. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times, he would shake off sleep and creep through the chill to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. So Buck has this like intense internal fear that at some point he's going to lose John Thornton because he has lost all these other previous owners in his life. If you've ever rescued a shelter dog or an animal that's had another owner, they definitely get this attachment to you that is unlike the attachment that a dog you might have gotten as a puppy. My first dog was like this. You couldn't leave him alone. I couldn't leave him at a like doggy daycare if I went away. He had to stay at my parents because he had this intense fear that we were going to abandon him just like he had been abandoned by his previous owners. But in spite of this great love he bore John Thornton, which seemed to bespeak the soft, civilizing influence, the strain of the primitive, which the Northland had aroused in him, remained alive and active. Faithfulness and devotion, things born of fire and roof, were his, yet he retained his wildness and wiliness. He was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than the dog of a soft Southland stamped with the marks of generations of civilizations. Because of this very great love, he could not steal from this man, but from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate an instant. Well, the cunning in which he stole enabled him to escape detection. So Buck hasn't changed his personality. He's still the same cunning, wild survival dog that he had to become once he came north. But he reserves these for strangers and never takes anything from John Thornton because of his great love for him. His face and body were scored by the teeth of many dogs, and he fought as fiercely as ever and more shrewdly. Skeet and Nig were too good-natured for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But the strange dog, no matter what the breed or valor, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy and found himself struggling for life with a terrible antagonist. And Buck was merciless. He had learned well the law of club and fang, and he never forewent an advantage or drew back from the foe he had started on the way to death. He had lessoned from Spitz and from the chief fighting dogs of the police and mail, and knew there was no middle course. He must master or be mastered, while to show mercy was a weakness. Mercy did not exist in the primordial. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings made for death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law, and this mandate down out of the depths of time he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He linked the past with the present, and the eternity behind him throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm in which he swayed to the tides and the seasons swayed. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-breasted dog, white-fanged and long-furred, but behind him were the shades of all manner of dogs, half-wolves and wild wolves, urgent and prompting, tasting the savor of the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him, and telling him the sounds made by the wildlife in the forest, dictating his moods, directing his actions, laying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him and beyond him, and becoming themselves the stuff of his dreams. So even while he is with John Thornton, he still is having these wild urges by the fire, these kind of like hearkenings back to the old times of these half wolf, half dogs that used to travel with humankind. So peremptorily means commandingly. So peremptorily did these shades beckon him, that each day mankind and the claims of mankind slipped farther from him. Deep in the forest a call was sounding, and as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and the beaten earth around it, and to plunge into the forest, and on, he knew not where or why. Nor did he wonder where or why, the call sounding imperiously deep in the forest. But as soon as he gained the soft, unbroken earth and the green shade, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. So this is where the title of the book comes into play. So at this point, he's hearing the call of the wild, or this lure into the wilderness away from the fire and John Thornton. But every time he goes to leave and explore, he comes back because of this love of John Thornton that brings him back to the fire and back to the hearth. Thornton alone held him. The rest of mankind was as nothing. Chance travelers might praise or pet him, but he was cold under it all. And from a too demonstrative man, he would get up and walk away. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the long-expected raft, Buck refused to notice them till he learned they were close to Thornton. After that, he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, accepting favors from them as though he favored them by accepting. They were of the same large type as Thornton, living close to the earth, thinking simply and seeing clearly. And ere they swung the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson, they understood Buck and his ways, and did not insist upon an intimacy such as obtained with Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among man could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do. When Thornton commanded, one day they had a grub stake themselves at the proceeds of the raft, and left Dawson for the headwaters of the Tanana. And the men and dogs were sitting on a crest of a cliff which fell away straight down to naked bedrock 300 feet below. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete to the experiment he had in mind. "Jump, Buck," he commanded, sweeping his arm out over the chasm. The next instant, he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging him back to safety. "It's uncanny," Pete said after it was all over and they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. "No, it is splendid, and it is terrible, too. Do you know, sometimes it makes me afraid?" "I'm not hankering to be a man that lays hands on you while he's around," Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head toward Buck. "Py Django," was Hans' contribution. "Not mineself, either." It was at Circle City, before the year was out, that Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burden, a man evil-tempered and malicious, had been picking a quarrel with a tenderfoot at the bar. Tenderfoot's like a new person to the wild. When Thornton stepped good-naturedly between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burden struck out without warning, straight from the table. Thornton was sent spinning and saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the chair. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but was something which is best described as a roar, and he saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burden's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm and was hurled backward to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off, but while a surgeon checked the bleeding, he prowled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A miners' meeting called on the spot decided the dog had sufficient provocation and Buck was discharged, but his reputation was made, and from that day, his name spread through every camp in Alaska. So Buck is there to defend John Thornton. Anybody makes a move about him, he's taking him down. This scene reminds me of my best friend Betsy had a giant half wolf, half Malamute dog. So it looked like a super giant sled dog. And I was at her house in Massachusetts one night, and she was having kind of like an argument, but not like an aggressive argument, just like a disagreement with one of her roommates. And I'm sitting over at the table. I have her giant wolf dog at my feet, and my friend starts to raise her voice, and the boy she was arguing with kind of just made a movement like toward her, not even aggressively, just kind of like, "Are you kidding me?" Like that type of thing. The next thing I knew, that dog had leaped over the couch, and this boy was on the floor with the dog's teeth around his neck, like in a second flat. And the only reason he didn't kill him was because that dog loved me too. And I jumped over and grabbed the dog and pulled him off, with my friend screaming. But that type of loyalty, or, you got to be careful with something like that, because you don't, nowadays they definitely would have put Buck to sleep for attacking a human. But in this situation, what they do is they have a trial in the town, and they're like, provocation means like you taunted somebody into doing it, right? So in their mind, they're like, fine, he deserved to be taken down. He was reasonably provoked. So Buck gets away with it. In today's society, they would put somebody's dog to sleep for doing something like that. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life in quite another fashion. The three partners were lining a long and narrow poling boat down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, snubbing with a thin manila rope from tree to tree, while Thornton remained in the boat, helping its descent by means of a pole and shouting directions to the shore. Buck on the other bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot where a ledge of barely submerged rocks jutted out into the river, Hans cast off the rope, and while Thornton pulled the boat out into the stream, ran down the bank with the end in his hand to snub the boat when it had cleared the ledge. This it did, and was flying downstream in a current as swift as a mill race when Hans checked it with the rope and checked too suddenly. The boat flirted over, and snubbed in the bank bottom up, while Thornton, flung sheer out of it, was carried downstream towards the worst part of the rapids, a stretch of wild water in which no swimmer could live. Buck had sprung in on the instant, and the end of 300 yards, amid a mad swirl of water, he overhauled Thornton. When he felt him grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress shoreward was slow, because he's going against current. The progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roaring, where the wild current went wilder and was rent in shreds and spray by the rocks, which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water, as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch, was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over a rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of the churning water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own and swept on downstream, struggling desperately but unable to win back. And when he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high as though for a last look, then turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hansen at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. They knew that the time a man could cling to the slippery rocks in the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could up the bank to the point far above where Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been snubbing the boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it would neither strangle him nor impede or stop his swimming, and they launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream, and he discovered the mistake too late, when Thornton was abreast of him and a bare half dozen strokes away, while he was being carried haplessly past. Hans promptly snubbed with the rope, and as though Buck were a boat. The rope thus tightening on him in the speed of the current, he was jerked up to the surface, and under the surface he remained till his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to him as though they could not make out the words of it. They knew he was in his extremity or close to death. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet and ran up the bank ahead of the men to the point of previous departure. Again the rope was attached and was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but would not be guilty of it a second time. Hans paid out the rope, permitting no slack, and while Pete kept it clear of coils, Buck held on till he was a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned with the speed of an express train, headed down upon him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a battering ram, with the whole force of the current behind him, he reached up and closed with both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans snubbed the rope around the tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, strangling, suffocating, sometimes an uppermost and sometimes the other, dragged across the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and snags. They veered into the bank. Thornton came to, or awake, belly downward, and being violently propelled back and forth across a drift log by Hans and Pete. His first glance was for Buck, whose limp and apparently lifeless body Nig was setting up a howl, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes, and Thornton himself was bruised and battered, and he went carefully over to Buck's body when he had been brought around, finding 3 broken ribs. That settles it, he announced. We camp right here, and camp they did, till Buck's ribs knitted and he was able to travel. So this is like extreme loyalty, no matter how severe these circumstances are. Buck does not give up. This is like true love and passion and loyalty. And this is one of the things I want you to think about when you write a paragraph describing this connection between the two of them. That's it for today. I'll see you for the second half of chapter 6 pretty soon. Okay, bye-bye.